This is Luke chapter 20 from New King James Version. Now it happened on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, that the chief priests and the scribes, together with the elders, confronted him and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is he who gave you this authority?" And I think this is a reasonable question, because Jesus was saying things that were different than what everybody else is saying. So you have to test the spirits. You have to test the teachers to see if they're right or wrong. We need to also question what everybody teaches us. Say, well, are you making this up on your own? Or do you have authority from God to say these things? Now, in my background, and the people that I often go to church with or used to, they were heavy on authority, but yet they would take the smallest little thing that was obviously their opinion and say, I have authority from God to say this. In other words, like they would say, I have authority to condemn all instrumental music in worship because Colossians 3:16 says, sing and make melody in your heart. So they would say that God says you can't have instruments, when what God actually said was you need to sing. He didn't say you can't have instruments. He said sing. And so oftentimes people assume they have authority from God for everything they do, when actually they are just assuming authority. They can't prove that they have authority from God. Verse 3, but he answered and said to them, I also will ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? And they reasoned among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are persuaded that John was a prophet. So they answered they did not know where it was from. And Jesus said, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And Jesus' answer was a very good answer. It didn't satisfy them, but he trapped them. He knew their hearts. He knew what they were thinking. They rejected John the Baptist, yet John the Baptist was a legitimate, God-approved, authorized prophet. The people accepted him, and I think it's interesting that the leaders of the Jews actually were afraid of the people. You'd think that they had such authority, they commanded so much respect from the people, that the people would just believe whatever they said, but apparently they didn't. I would think that they would, but I'm kind of surprised that they at least have this evidence that they didn't always do whatever they said. Verse 9, then he began to tell the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard, leased it to vinedressers, and went into a far country for a long time. So he says the man planted the vineyard, and then he leased it to vinedressers, which I think means other people tended to it and made sure that everything grew, and probably even picked the grapes or whatever, because he was gone for a long time. Now at vintage time, I think it means at harvest time or something, he sent a servant to the vinedressers, that they might give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the vinedressers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. So this is obviously a parable of God sending prophets and the Jews killing the prophets. Again, he sent another servant, and they beat him also. Or in other words, God sent another prophet, and they beat him and persecuted him too. Treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent a third, and they wounded him also and cast him out. Now, I don't think that we can point to any particular three prophets. I think it's just talking about God sent multiple prophets, not just one. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Probably they will respect him when they see him." But when the vine dressers saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours." So they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Let me stop right there. Verse 16. So the Son is obviously Jesus. So they sent multiple prophets, and then the Jews rejected them and killed them because they didn't want to hear what God's prophets had to say. So when God sends his Son, you would think that they would respect him, but they rejected him too and killed him because he was the most offensive of all, because he actually stood up and rebuked the scribes and Pharisees. So it's an obvious parallel to God sending prophets and then sending his Son and then them killing Jesus. Verse 16. And this is before Jesus had died. So he again is prophesying of his own death. Verse 16. He will come and destroy those vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. So I think what that means is Jesus is going to come and destroy the Jews and give the kingdom to the Gentiles, or to whoever believes, Jew or Gentile. And that's what he did in 70 AD. He came, he destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and the whole Jewish way of life, and he gave the kingdom to whoever will believe in him. And when they heard it, they said, "Certainly not." Then he looked at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." So I guess the Jews didn't see themselves as rejecting the chief cornerstone. And I guess, the builders could be anybody. That is Psalm 118:22. Whoever falls on that stone will be broken, but on whoever it falls, it will grind him to powder. So if you trip over the stumbling block of believing in Jesus, then you will be wounded. But if God ever decides to destroy you, then you will be ground into powder. So either way is bad. Either you stumble and fall and get broken, or God loses patience or runs out of patience or just decides to execute judgment and grinds you into powder. And the chief priests and the scribes that very hour sought to lay hands on him, but they feared the people, for they knew he had spoken this parable against them. So a lot of times people misunderstand what Jesus plainly says, but the chief priests and the scribes and Pharisees understood that he was talking about them. They understood that Jesus was saying that you rejected me, and I'm the chief cornerstone, and I'm going to fall on you and grind you to powder. So it's a direct threat, and they perceived it to be so. So they are definitely his enemies at this point. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous. I think that's what all the Pharisees did. They pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and authority of the governor. I think that would be the Roman governor is what they're looking for, especially based on the question that they asked. Then they asked him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, obviously, they wanted him to say, "No, you don't have to pay taxes to Caesar." I don't know why they would even think he would say that. I guess their concept of the Jewish Messiah, if he was claiming to be the Messiah, they thought that he was going to overthrow the Roman government. They thought that he was going to be a military conqueror to free the Jews from all oppressors. And I guess if that's the case, then why would you pay taxes to someone who's about to overthrow that government? Maybe that's what they were thinking. But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Why do you test me? Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So he's talking about physical things and spiritual things. Your heart, your attitude, your mind, the way you treat other people, that's what God cares about. And he doesn't care at all about money. Now, the Pharisees were lovers of money. I think we said that a few chapters ago. But Jesus' kingdom was not a physical kingdom, nor was it one that he was going to conquer his enemies in warfare. But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silent. So they thought they were being smart. They thought they were being crafty. We're going to catch him, but they couldn't. Then some of the Sadducees, who deny that there is a resurrection, came to him and asked him. So now, it's easy to remember that the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection, because it would be very sad, you see, if there was no resurrection. If when we died physically, there was nothing after that, that'd be very sad. I really don't understand why they thought that. I do know that in the Old Covenant, there's not a lot of talk about eternal life. It's most of it's about obey and be pleasing to God, and a lot of it also is associated with things that happen in this life on earth, because he says, if you don't do what I tell you, then I'm going to take you captive by other nations and you'll be slaves. So a lot of it does talk about consequences on earth. I think there's a lot that talks about eternal life too, but if you're not prepared to think about it, then you wouldn't perceive it that way. They didn't believe in resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies having a wife, and he dies without children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died without children, and the second took her as a wife, and he died childless. Then the third took her, and in like manner the 7 also. And they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife does she become? For all 7 had her as wife. So, since they don't believe in a resurrection, I can just hear them snickering under their voice when they think they've got him backed in the corner. So, therefore, in the quote resurrection, obviously they had heard Jesus talking about life after death and the resurrection, because they knew that he believed in resurrection. For them to even ask this question. Jesus answered and said to them, The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are counted worthy to attain that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, nor can they die any more, for they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But even Moses showed in the burning bush passage that the dead are raised, when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Now, I see there only being 2 ages. The age that was the Jewish age, and the age to come is the Christian age. Now, when he says the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, I guess you would say, well, that's the Jewish age. And then you might say, well, that makes no sense, because we still marry and are given in marriage in this Christian age. But I think Jesus is making a distinction. Even though I believe there's only 2 ages and the Christian age lasts forever, it starts when you're a human and it never ends. It doesn't end or change even when you die. I believe we have resurrection now. As a believer, we have resurrection. Our spirits have been born again. Our spirits are alive and have eternal life while we are still living in the fleshly body. But I believe Jesus is making the distinction Oh. Well, even when it says nor can they die anymore, there's our scriptures that talk about never dying. Jesus said, "If you believe in me, you will never die." So, but what I believe what he's talking about is the spiritual element of it. And even though marriage is a physical thing. It's only relevant for as long as you live. When you get married, you're only married as long as you live. You're bound by marriage as long as your spouse lives. We could certainly look at scriptures that say that. And I believe what that's talking about, as long as you live physically in this body. But whenever you leave the body, whenever you die, your spirit continues on in the same kingdom of Christianity, but yet it goes to God in the place where God is, which is heaven. And at that point, you're equal to the angels, you're sons of God, and there is no marrying or giving in marriage. Now, I understand that maybe my reasoning there is not the best, but I believe that's what he's talking about. If you can help me out, then feel free to help me out. Then some of the scribes answered and said, "Teacher, you have spoken well." But after that, they dared not question him anymore. So there's two clever questions in this chapter, and Jesus is not fooled by their craftiness. And he said to them, "How can they say that the Christ is the son of David?" So Jesus is saying, how can they say that the Messiah is the son of David? Now David himself said in the book of Psalms, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." Therefore David calls him Lord. How is he then his son? So obviously the Messiah was supposed to be a descendant of David. The Jews knew that very well. They expected the Messiah to sit on David's throne. But Jesus is making the point. This is not just a regular human earthly descendant of David who takes over his physical earthly kingdom of the Jewish nation. This is someone who is bigger, better, more important than David, and his kingdom is different and more important than David's kingdom was. Because David called him Lord. He was his descendant, but Jesus is Lord over David because Jesus was the Messiah. Then in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, "Beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." Now, it reminds me of the televangelist today. A lot of old women don't go to church. They just watch the televangelist on TV and send them their money. And that's how they would devour widows' houses. They take money from widows, take advantage of them, really. But the scribes, the scribes and Pharisees, it just says scribes, but I think it would include all the Jewish leaders, really, except for those who repented, had a humble heart, and became Christians and believers. But certainly, and I think there's a lot of preachers today who love the glory of being considered a righteous leader of the Christian people, and they are blinded by the glory that they seek. And I believe many of those would also receive the greater condemnation. All right, so that is the end of Luke chapter 20.